What a beautiful day. Let's read. We were talking about ideology and propaganda. The new relationship. These new propaganda methods have completely changed the relationship between propaganda and ideology, and as a result, the role and value of ideologies in the present world have changed. Propaganda's task is less and less to propagate ideologies. It now obeys its own laws and becomes autonomous. Propaganda no longer obeys an ideology. Ideology plays a certain role in propaganda. It can prevent propaganda from developing when the governmental centers themselves are the seat of an ideology. We shall see later how democratic ideology accelerates the expansion of propaganda. On the other hand, it has been shown how the belief in certain utopias, goodwill of people, harmonization of international interests, and so on, is also a negative factor here. Just as the ideology of democratic elites is less suitable than that of an aristocracy on the basis for a propaganda plan, conversely, when the belief of the elites is progressive, it will lead to a powerful propaganda. Thus, ideology partly determines whether a climate is favorable or unfavorable to the certain use of propaganda, but it no longer is the decisive factor. The propagandist is not and cannot be a believer. Moreover, he cannot believe in the ideology he must use in his propaganda. He is merely a man at the service of a party, a state, or some other organization, and his task is to ensure the efficiency of that organization. He no more needs to share the official ideology than the prefect of a French department needs to share the political doctrines of the national government. What's a prefect? If the propagandist has any political conviction, he must put it aside in order to be able to use some popular mass ideology. He cannot share that ideology, for he must use it as an object and manipulate it without the respect that he would have for it if he believed in it. He quickly acquires contempt for these popular images and beliefs in his work. He must change the propaganda themes so frequently that he cannot possibly attach himself to any formal, sentimental, political, or other aspect of the ideology. More and more, the propagandist is a technician using a keyboard of material media and psychological techniques. And in the midst of all that, ideology is only one of the incidental and interchangeable cogs. It has often been stated that the propagandist eventually comes to despise doctrines of men. This must be put into context with the fact, analyzed above, that the organization served by propaganda is not basically interested in disseminating a doctrine, spreading an ideology, or creating an orthodoxy. It seeks instead to unite within itself as many individuals as possible, to mobilize them, and to transform them into active militants in the service of an orthopraxy. What's an orthopraxy? Correct conduct in both ethical and liturgical, as opposed to faith or grace. Orthopraxy is in contrast with orthodoxy, which emphasizes correct belief. Okay, so orthopraxy is about your behavior. Some will object that the great movements that have used propaganda, such as communism or Nazism, did have a doctrine and did create an ideology. I reply that that was not their principal object. Ideology and doctrine were merely accessories used by propaganda to mobilize individuals. The aim was the power of the party or state supported by the masses. Proceeding from there, the problem is no longer whether or not a political ideology is valid. The propagandist cannot ask himself that question. For him, it is senseless to debate whether the Marxist view of history has more validity than any other, or whether the racist doctrine is true. That is of no importance in the framework of propaganda. The only problem is that of effectiveness, of utility. The point is not to ask oneself whether some economic or intellectual doctrine is valid, but only whether it can furnish effective catchwords capable of mobilizing the masses here and now. Therefore, when faced with an ideology that exists among the masses and commands a certain amount of belief, the propagandist must ask himself two questions. First, is this existing ideology an obstacle to action to be taken, or does it lead the masses to disobey the state? Does it make them passive? This last question is essential, for example, for propagandists who operate in milieux influenced by Buddhism. In many cases, such an ideology will indeed be an obstacle to blind action, if only to the extent that it sparks some intellectual activity. No matter how feeble or provides criteria. What? That has to be a typo. No matter how insecure for judgment or action. In this case, the propagandist must be careful not to run head-on into a prevailing ideology. All he can do is integrate it into his system, use some parts of it, deflect it, and so on. Second, he must ask himself whether the ideology, such as it is, can be used for his propaganda, whether it has psychologically predisposed an individual to submit to propaganda's impulsions. Oh, my water's over there. This is why one ideology cannot serve as a weapon against another ideology. Propaganda will never proclaim the superiority of an ideology over that of the enemy, for in doing so it would immediately fail. Against an opposing ideology, one can only counter with a waiting attitude, an attitude of hope, and with questions as to what the future will bring. By thus asking an ideological adversary concrete questions pertaining to the future, the propagandist follows Marx's method of progressing from language to life. In an Arab country colonized by whites, in view of the Islamic ideology that has developed hatred for Christians, a perfect predisposition to nationalist Arab and anti-colonialist propaganda will exist. The propagandist will use that ideology directly, regardless of its content. He can become an ardent protagonist of Islam without believing in the least of its religious doctrine. Similarly, a communist propagandist can disseminate a nationalist or democratic ideology because it is useful, effective, and profitable, and because he finds it already formed and part of public opinion, even if he himself is anti-nationalist and anti-democratic. The fact that he reinforces a democratic belief in the public is of no importance. No one knows that such beliefs are no obstacle to the establishment of a dictatorship. By utilizing the democratic ideology that communism supports, the Communist Party obtains the consent of the masses to its action, which then puts the communist organization in control. Propaganda thus brings about the transition from democratic beliefs to a new form of democracy. Public opinion is so uncertain and unclear as to the content of its ideologies that it follows that the one that says the magic words, not realizing the contradictions between the proclamation of a catchword and the action that follows it. Once the machine is in control, there can be no objection to it by those who adhered to the previously prevailing ideology, which is always officially adopted and proclaimed by the new organization in power. People live, therefore, in the mental confusion that propaganda purposely seeks to create. In the face of existing, usable ideologies, the propagandist can take one of two paths. He can either stimulate them or mythologize them. Jesus. He can either stimulate them or mythologize them. In fact, ideologies lend themselves well to both methods. On the one hand, an ideology can be expressed in a catchword, a slogan. It can be reduced to a simple idea deeply anchored in the popular consciousness. And public opinion is used to reacting automatically to the expressions of a former accepted ideology. Words such as democracy, country, and social justice can now set off the desired reflexes. They have been reduced to stimuli capable of obtaining reflexes in public opinion, which can turn from adoration to hatred without transition. They evoke past actions and aspirations. To be sure, if a formula is to be able to stimulate, it must correspond to existing conditioned reflexes that were forged gradually in the course of history by adherence to an ideology. The propagandist limits himself to what is already present. From there on, he can use any ideology. From there on, he can use any ideological content at all, no matter where or when. Differences in application will be determined according to psychological, historical, and economic criteria to ensure the best utilization of ideology in the realm of action. I have said that ideology is a complex system capable of evoking one aspect while leaving out another. The propagandist's ability will consist precisely in making these choices. On the other hand, the propagandist can proceed by transforming ideology into myth. Some ideologies can indeed serve as a springboard for the creation of myths by the propagandist. Such transformation rarely takes place spontaneously. Generally, ideology is quite vague, has little power to move men to action, and cannot control the individual's entire consciousness. But it furnishes the elements of content and belief. It weds itself to myth by the complicated mixture of ideas and sentiments, by grafting the irrational onto political and economic elements. Ideology differs radically from myth in that it has no basic roots, no relation to humanity's great primitive myths. I have already said that it would be impossible to create a complete new myth through propaganda. However, the existence of an ideology within a group is the best possible foundation for the elaboration of a myth. In many cases, a precise operation and a more pressing and incisive formulation will suffice. That the message must be formulated for use by the mass media automatically contributes to this. The fact that the widespread belief is now expressed in 1/3 the number of words and shouted through millions of loudspeakers gives it new force and urgency. The coloration supplied by psychological techniques, the power of efficiency demonstrated by the integration in an action, the overall nature attributed to the construction of an intellectual universe in which ideology is the keystone. All that can be accomplished by the propagandist. In such fashion, socialist ideology was transformed into myth by Leninist propaganda. Patriotic ideology became national myth, and the ideology of happiness was transformed into myth at the end of the 19th century. Excuse me. In this fashion, too, the myth of progress was constructed from a group of propagandas based on bourgeoisie ideology. Finally, the propagandists can use ideology for purposes of justification. I have shown on several occasions that justification is an essential function of propaganda. The existence of a generally accepted ideology is a remarkable instrument for providing a good conscience. When the propagandist refers to collective beliefs, the man whom he induces to act in accord with those beliefs will experience a feeling of almost unshakable self-justification. To act in conformity with collective beliefs provides security and a guarantee that one acts properly. Propaganda reveals this consonance to the individual, renders the collective belief perceptible, conscious, and personal for him. It gives him a good conscience by making him aware of the collectivity of beliefs. Propaganda rationalizes the justification that man discovers in the prevailing ideology and gives him the power to express himself. This holds true, for example, for the ideology of peace utilized by the Communist Party. As soon as this ideology is used, everything, even hatred, is justified by it. For a long time, man's actions, just as certain as his reactions, have been partially inspired by ideology. The masses may act because of a spontaneous belief, a succinct idea accepted by all, or in pursuit of an objective more or less vaguely outlined by an ideology. Democratic ideology sparked such behavior, but the relationship of ideology to propaganda has completely changed this. In a group in which modern propaganda is being made, man no longer acts in accord with a spontaneous ideology, but only through impulses that come to him from such propaganda. Only the ignorant can still believe that ideas, doctrines, beliefs can make man act without the utilization of psycho-sociological methods. Ideology not used by propaganda is ineffective and not taken seriously. The humanist ideology no longer provokes a response. In the face of modern propaganda, intellectuals have been completely disarmed and can no longer evoke the values of humanism. Torture is implicitly accepted by public opinion, which expresses its dismay only in words but not in action. With regard to the war in Algeria, it is well known that the most ardent defenders of P.H. Simon, a young lieutenant who exposed the practice of torture during that war, defended him only verbally, and when they could afford to, once they were in combat, plunged into such action. Such ideas were relegated to a secondary level, and the FLN and military propaganda, which on both sides accused the enemy of torture and thus legitimized its own actions, took over again. The same is true for Christian ideology, which no longer inspires action. Christians are caught in a psycho-sociological mechanism that conditions them to create Christians are caught in a psycho-sociological mechanism that conditions them to certain practices, despite their attachment to other ideas. Those ideas remain pure ideology because they are not being taken over by propaganda, and they are not taken over because they are not usable. In this fashion, such an ideology loses its reality and becomes an abstraction. It loses all effectiveness in relation to other ideologies being used by propaganda. Moreover, in this relationship between ideology and action, we emphasize that nowadays action creates ideology, not vice versa, as the idealists who relate to past situations still would like to believe. Through action, one learns to believe in some truth and even formulate it. Today, ideology progressively builds itself around actions sanctioned by propaganda. For example, in order to justify certain actions in Algeria, an entire complex ideology was created. Thus, in various ways, all the result of propaganda, ideology is increasingly losing its importance in the modern world. It is devalued whether propaganda uses it or not. In the latter case, because it reveals its ineffectiveness and cannot prevail against the competition. In the former, because when used, if it is broken up, some aspects of it are used and others pushed aside. The same holds true for ideology as for doctrine. When propaganda uses it, it destroys it. The transformation of the Marxist doctrine by propaganda, first Lenin's and then Stalin's, is well known. Works such as those by P. Chambra, de Lefebvre, and Lukács explain that this evisceration of doctrine by propaganda very well. All that is believed, known, and accepted is what propaganda has promulgated. It is the same for ideology, which is merely a popular and sentimental derivation of doctrine. One can no longer establish anything at all on genuine ideologies in social groups. One can no longer hope to find in such ideologies a solid point of support for redressing man or society. Ideology has become part of the system of propaganda and depends on it. This can have decisive consequences, for one must not forget this is the road by which a change in culture can take place, that is, a true change of civilization, which was far maintained by the stability of ideologies and chain thinking. Alright, 22 minutes. Suppose that's a good time to stop. My voice is kind of hurting. Call it a day, I suppose.